My name is Grace. I've been helping co-host these sessions. This is our third, as I said. Our summer school feminist resisting fascism summer school series in the light of rising authoritarianism, expanding militarism, and deepening economic inequality. Uh, we are going to be using feminism as a lens to be looking at front lines of resistance. This is part 3 of our 6-part political education series designed to equip participants with historical context, analytical tools, and transnational strategies needed to confront fascist ideologies and build a movement for a just and liberated future. As I said, through a feminist lens, this series explores how imperialism, militarism, and propaganda and economic exploitation fuels authoritarian movements and how collective action and global solidarity can dismantle them. First, I'm going to pass it to Noor to go over our norms, and then I'm going to pass it to CODEPINK co-director Danica to start our session. We will have a Q&A at the end, so please hold all your questions in the chat and share them throughout the night, and we will be adding them for the Q&A later. But I will pass it over to Noor.
Thank you, Grace. As Grace said, I'm Noor. I'm CODEPINK's Palestine campaigner. Just going to go over our norms real quick. So I see you all are introducing yourself in the chat. Please continue to do so. You can put your name and where you're calling in from. And during this call, please remember our norms, which are to be respectful. We are not having debates. We're having discussions. And we're here to learn from each other and take action for Palestine, the people, and the planet. And of course, be kind, be curious. And this is a big one. Please, please, please stay muted. We record and live stream these classes, so we want to minimize disruptions as much as we can. But I will pass it to Danica now to introduce and moderate our session tonight.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all. Thanks for tuning in. This session is on the war economy. I was really excited to do this session, even more excited to do it with Lindsay from IPS, who I'll introduce in a moment. But if you Google the definition of a war economy, it'll tell you, and this is a direct quote from like Google's dumb AI feature, it's a nation's mobilization of its resources and industry to support military production and the war effort during wartime. This involves shifting production away from consumer goods towards military equipment, often involving increased government control and resource allocation. So an example of that is the US during World War II, for example. We sort of overhauled our economy to be centered around the war. Lindsay and I will be talking about a slightly different definition of war economy because after World War II, the US never really shifted back to this peace economy. World War II made the US a superpower. The war industry got rich, and the ruling class learned very quickly that keeping the US in a perpetual and escalating war economy was good for them. A lot of you may be familiar with the $1 trillion Pentagon budget and how outrageous it is that our country allocates so much money to the military. That alone, the $1 trillion Pentagon budget, doesn't make up the war economy. It's a symptom of the war economy, right? 50% of the war budget goes to private companies. Those companies have spread out all across the country, having jobs and factories in every single state that can be used to lobby politicians in DC for better contracts, for weapons deals, that sort of thing. The biggest wealth management groups in the US invest public employees' pension funds. So like library employees, sanitation employees, fire departments, pensions into war. Some of the biggest mutual funds, top companies are companies like Lockheed Martin, for example. Oh, did I get muted? When did that happen? What was the last thing you got? It's okay. The biggest wealth management groups in the US invest public employees' pensions into war. Some of the biggest mutual funds, top companies are companies like Lockheed Martin, for example. So the $1 trillion Pentagon budget is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And we have to go deeper to understand where the war economy hurts us and where we can overcome it. And it's our responsibility, especially right now, to understand it better, because it's ultimately what keeps us at the margins. It's exactly what lets fascism thrive. when Trump and Congress feel like they can cut Medicaid and food stamps to fund their Gestapo-like ICE raids. That's fascism. That's the war economy. And to protect our neighbors and to defeat fascism, we must also demand a shift to a peace economy, one that doesn't rest our economic realities on being at a perpetual state of war. We deserve a lot better. And I have Lindsay Koshgarian, who I'm so excited to have on the summer school session. Lindsay is the program director of the National Priorities Project. Her work on the federal budget priorities highlights the militarization of federal budgets and the corresponding lack of investment in people and the planet. Her published reports include analyses of militarization and of the federal budget, from the Pentagon and war to militarization of US borders and the militarization of law enforcement. And her work has appeared in outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, and others. And Lindsay's work has been really critical for CODEPINK because Lindsay does and presents and researches on the facts that we need to outline these trade-offs. When we invest in war, what's getting cut? Where's the austerity? So Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on the session with us to talk to us about the war economy.
Thanks so much for having me, Danica. I'm really glad to see everybody here.
So the first thing I wanted to chat with you about is how did the US economy get so centered on the war industry? And when did it occur and when did it start shifting?
Yeah, so as you hinted in your introduction, this is a post-World War II phenomenon. As many folks may know, the United States actually was started without plans for a standing army, and it took quite a while for it to evolve, but by the time it was post-World War II, that was when we started to see the military-industrial complex that we have today. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the Eisenhower quote about the military-industrial complex. And just, I know you already know the quote, but that quote was from 1961. And Eisenhower wasn't being prophetic. He was talking about something that he already saw happening. So, that's 15 years after World War II, give or take. What we know about military spending after World War II is that the US did, in fact, by that point, very much have a standing army. There was a military budget, the peak of the military budget that we've seen so far ever in the history of this country was World War II. And then it came sharply down after that and peaked again with every war that we've seen since then. So it goes up again for the Korean War, it goes up again for the Vietnam War, it goes up again for the Cold War during Reagan years in the 1980s, it goes up again for the post 9/11 wars. But the secret is that every time it goes up after one of those wars, it never comes all the way back down. And that is really where you can see the military industrial complex being built, is that it ramps way up for war, and then it only comes down partway. And then the next war, it ramps way up. And so all of that is sort of, you can think of each of those steps where it doesn't come all the way back down as another kind of block being added to the military industrial complex and the war economy in this country. So that's building up the companies. And then there are only two, other than the ends of wars and that partial retraction that we see in Pentagon spending, there are only two real periods, especially in the last 50 years, where we've seen military spending come down. One of those is the 1990s, and that's the end of the Cold War. And there's actually a consensus that we don't need as much of a military anymore. We don't need as many military bases. We don't need as many weapons contractors. We don't need as much of all of this. And there's this massive effort that the Pentagon is actually a part of to partially retract. But all of that only adds up to about a 25% reduction in Pentagon spending. So think of how much that means is still left, especially after the massive buildup of the Cold War and the 1980s. There's a huge amount of that left. And then at the same time, in the 1990s, they're trying to kind of pull back. But another thing that's happening at the same time is that the contractors, the weapons contractors that are making up this war economy start joining together. They start merging. And whereas before that point in the 1990s, there were many smaller contractors that made up this war economy, coming out of the 1990s, we have these huge, massive contractors. And the top five that we see today which is the Lockheed Martins, Northrop Grumman's, Boeing, Raytheon, GE, and those become these mammoth companies that have such a huge piece of the war economy and like take so much money in, and therefore also wield so much power in terms of our government. So that's sort of still where we are today. We have seen that kind of that pattern continue where the spending went way up for the war on terror. It came somewhat down. The second time that you see a significant reduction in Pentagon spending is actually after 2010, after the Tea Party gets their hands on things and they cut spending on everything, and that includes the Pentagon. And so there's actually a couple years there where it starts to go down, but then that goes off the rails and it just shoots right back up. And then we see what we've seen over the last few years, which is just historically huge increases. All of this time, about half, it kind of ebbs and flows, but for all of this time, about half of that entire budget is going to contractors. So that's the war economy. I think you can say that it also extends to some degree to troops, to sort of this provision of economic opportunity that we see through the military where, you know, hey, if you join the military, we'll send you to college, or if you join the military, you can have the GI Bill benefits, you can have these things. So I think we can kind of consider some of that part of the war economy too. Especially if you look at the presence of our bases around the country. Those are a huge part of the war economy. A lot of us probably have military bases in our own communities. And so we know that, there's a big local dependence on that part of the war economy also.
Yeah, thanks for you gave us such a broad trajectory so quickly. I appreciate that. And I was actually rereading the Eisenhower speech in preparation for this, just to see if I could get any new kernels out of it. And one interesting quote I found, and Lindsay said it was in 1961 where he made the speech. He said, "Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry," which is really puzzling to think about now, given that one of our largest exports in the US is weapons. We export war as much as we conduct it. So I think I gave it in the preparation for this or reading for after, but Profits of War, for those listening, by William Hartung, is really amazing. It's dense, but Bill Hartung's very funny. I think the book is like funny to read. It's entertaining at least, but it takes you through the war economy just under the eyes of Lockheed Martin, and it even follows Lockheed Martin's merger that happened in the 90s, I believe, as well, because it was Martin Marietta and just Lockheed. So that's a really good book to read if you prefer the sort of a microcosm understanding of the war economy. So I think it'd be good to talk a little bit more about the role of weapons companies in sustaining this war economy. And you do so much great research on the Pentagon budgets. Can you tell folks a little bit more about how these weapons companies kind of factor into the creation of the Pentagon budget?
Yeah. So obviously they have a say. One of my favorite, I can't say whether this ended up true at the end of the first Trump administration, but there was one point a couple of years into the Trump administration where they were still sharing their logs of who was visiting the White House. And so you could see how often the weapons contractors were showing up. And there was one point where I remember I kind of looked and tallied it up, and the number of times that the then CEO of Lockheed Martin had visited the White House was more than the number of times the Mexican president had, which, this is one of our nearest neighbors, should be one of our closest allies. But the relationship clearly was not nearly as close as the relationship with the CEO of this company, and Lockheed is the biggest contractor. So they're super close. They propose weapons systems. Folks may know about the right to repair issue, where not only do they propose weapons systems and have them accepted and then build those weapons systems for the Pentagon, but in many instances, the company that makes the weapon systems is the only one that is legally able to actually repair them or maintain them, so that when the Pentagon needs to maintain a weapon system, they're paying more money to the contractor. In a lot of those cases, it would be cheaper for the Pentagon to do it themselves. Of course, in a lot of those cases, they shouldn't have the weapon system to begin with, but just as a sort of clear example of the way that those companies are stringing the Pentagon along, and the Pentagon is in most cases perfectly happy to go along with it. There is sort of the right to repair issue now where they're starting to want some of that back. But the relationship is incredibly cozy. And we also know that lobbying is kind of the obvious example. I actually am kind of struck sometimes by the lobbying isn't even bigger considering how big the industry is and considering how close it is. But I think the fact that it's not bigger actually speaks to just how close they are, that they don't actually need to just lobby. Because if you think about it, every sales visit that they're making to the Pentagon is a lobby visit. They don't have to claim it that way. But there's so much of that that goes on that we can't even measure because it's not measured in lobbying dollars. So there's sort of all of that. And then there's also the issue of the revolving door, where you have Pentagon leaders who are coming in and out of weapons companies. They're joining boards, which are often paid boards. They're leaving boards. They're joining staffs. They're becoming CEOs. They're coming back and forth from the Pentagon to the contractors, back to the Pentagon. And that also happens with like congressional staffers and things too. So there's all of this sort of just intermix where it's almost as if it's not even separate.
Wow. Yeah, and I just remember the first time I learned about this, it just felt like I was like peeling an onion. Just there was so much there afterwards. And these weapons companies get what, 50% of the
They get about half of the Pentagon budget every year.
Yeah, so $1 trillion, half of it's going directly to private companies, whether it be for new weapon systems or the repairs that Lindsay was talking about. That's really absurd. I don't think it was always like that. So they have a huge vested interest in keeping this spigot on, because a vast majority of their revenue comes from the Pentagon alone. I think it's like over 80% for some of these companies.
Yeah. So we as far as what percentage of the Pentagon budget goes to contractors, we only have data going back to the early 80s. So that's sort of Cold War. And it's sort of fluctuated around 50% that whole time. So for at least that time period, that's been pretty consistent. I think probably earlier than that, if we could look at the 50s and 60s, I think we'd see something very different, but we don't have the data to do that. But yeah, where things are right now, the big companies, Lockheed is one of the highest, but they get as much as 80 or even more higher percentage of their entire revenues from federal contracts from the Pentagon. So that it's fair to say they wouldn't exist without these contracts. And I think, one thing that's really interesting about that is that you don't hear this argument made very often, and it's certainly not like a sort of immediately politically plausible argument, but if that much of their money is coming from the Pentagon, why aren't they just part of the Pentagon? Why aren't they just nationalize that? Like, why is that? Why are we allowing them to be a private company that can make profits and that can, pay their CEO a multi-million-dollar pay package and do all of these things? So I think that's a real question, and it's something that's so far from the norm in this country that it's practically sacrilege, but it really is a fair question.
Yeah, absolutely. At one time the lobby goes deep, but it's also at such a service level. When I went to DC for the first time, I got on the metro, and when I passed the Pentagon stop, there were ads for Lockheed Martin at the subway. I'm like, this is not, the F-35 is not a consumer good. It's like for these employees walking into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
So wild.
And it's wild to think that could be effective, right? That like
I know
walking into the Pentagon to go to work would see those ads and be like, yes, we should buy more of those. It's absurd to think about. But yes, it's absolutely true. If you go to there's like a few subway stops, the Pentagon in Crystal City, and they're all full of these ads. And sometimes one contractor will buy out the ads for the whole space. And so it'll just be that one. There's actually an interesting thing about that. There was somebody for the Quincy Institute a little while ago kind of went and did a survey of the Pentagon ads that were in some of those subway stops. And actually the DC Metro is supposed to have a policy that they don't allow political ads, but somehow they've decided that this doesn't count, even though obviously the ads are there, they're targeted at federal government employees,
Yeah.
the Pentagon, because of their political power. And so it's hard to call them anything else, but the DC Metro has continued to allow it.
I think we're at the stage of the war economy where like absurdity is like almost like a hallmark. Like it's only what makes sense is how much crazier it's getting. So the ads is like one function, but also if people read Prophets of War, there's instances like the most popular instances in the book where Lockheed Martin was charging $600 for a toilet seat for a plane. So there's just so many stories like that.
There, the price gouging is a huge issue. It's interesting because it's one that's also has some bipartisan appeal in Congress. And so you will hear like people on both sides of the aisle an outrage about this, whereas mostly you don't hear people on either side of the aisle being an outrage about the Pentagon budget overall. But another recent example is people may have seen 60 Minutes did an investigation of price gouging by Pentagon contractors just a couple years ago. And so this is a more recent example, but there was one part, like this little metal part that was being sold to the Pentagon. It's for aircraft. And so this company was also selling the same exact part to NASA. But they were charging the Pentagon, I think it was hundreds or thousands of times the amount that they were charging NASA for the exact same thing. And these are both part of the federal government. The Pentagon and NASA, both part of the federal government, both going to the same contractor, both buying the same exact thing. And they were just charging the Pentagon like hundreds of times more for the exact same thing just because they could. And they got away with it. Like the Pentagon didn't say no. The federal government eventually figured it out, but for a long time, they were just paying that price. And it's just such a clear example of how the Pentagon has way more money than they know what to do with. They don't even know where the money is going a lot of times. And so contractors are able to get away with this sort of thing.
Yeah, and because of the revolving door and because the money going into these politicians' campaigns and then lobbying expenditures alone, like, they've a vested interest on both sides of like keeping this relationship between the Pentagon and weapons companies going. But okay, I could talk about weapons companies for days because it's just so bad. Everything I learned is so bad. But we've talked about the $1 trillion Pentagon budget a little bit, but what are some of the other ways that the war economy seeps into like the fabric of our society that you think people don't talk about enough?
Yeah, there are so many ways. I mean, one is probably the biggest one is sort of just our acceptance of war and the war economy. Our acceptance that these are huge corporations that take our tax money and create weapons with them. The fact that that's allowed, like you said, the fact that the US is by far the world's biggest weapons provider. And that in so many cases where we're not directly involved with conflict, that's a big part of it. But there are ways where it really kind of comes back home. And so one of those, of course, is the 1033 program, which people may already know about, but this is the program where the Pentagon sends its surplus military equipment at no charge to local and state law enforcement agencies. And over time, that has ranged from everything from grenade launchers, which are no longer allowed, but were at one time. And one of my local police departments at one point had grenade launchers from the Pentagon, to military armored vehicles, which are still allowed, to rifles and ammunition, which are still allowed and are the most popularly transferred item today, is various rifles and ammunition from the Pentagon to local law enforcement, to more innocuous things like printers or t-shirts or just whatever they have. But it amounts to billions of dollars in weapons transfers. And of course, over time, we've seen some of that military equipment show up in law enforcement control of protests. We've seen it show up in we don't know whether it has literally shown up, but I think it has shown up in spirit in the rise of SWAT teams, which people don't know. The SWAT teams kind of went from almost non-existent to being like so popular that a vast, like many law enforcement agencies have them and just use them in kind of routine drug busts and things like that. And all of that is sort of that military influence trickling down and the availability of that equipment and those weapons. And the companies that make it, the many cases, Pentagon contractors, and the flash grenades that the SWAT teams use, and all of the sort of gear that they use. So it's trickling down into our local law enforcement. Of course, what we're seeing, which is not a brand new thing, but what we're seeing so much more even now, is trickling down into immigration enforcement. So for years, we've been seeing troops sent to the southern border to help kind of patrol and keep watch over the situation and do who knows what else. There's not a lot of transparency about it. But we're seeing now more of that. There are troops being sent to the southern border. The reconciliation budget bill that just passed and President Trump signed at the end of last week includes money specifically for the Pentagon to engage in immigration enforcement. And so that's the first time that I know of that there has been explicit money for the Pentagon to do immigration enforcement. There's always been sort of workarounds of funneling that money to that cause, but this is the first time it's been explicit. So we've seen that. We're seeing the military flights being used for deportations. We're seeing military bases, so far Guantanamo, being used for detaining immigrants, but we're expecting to see a lot more of that, especially now that they've passed this bill that has so much more funding for Trump's mass deportation agenda. So we'll be seeing more of that. So all of these things, and a lot of these things it's some of the same contractors. It's some of the same corporations that are providing tools. For a long time, this is not a new phenomenon. We've also seen some of the same military equipment being used. ICE carries military weapons. Border Patrol carries military weapons. Military drones have been used at the southern border for surveillance. And a lot of the companies that do kind of what you might think of as intelligence surveillance for the Pentagon are also getting into the game on immigration. So we're seeing it in a huge way in the immigration space, but we've also been seeing it for a long time in the local law enforcement space.
You're muted.
You're not
Okay.
muted, Lindsay.
Okay. You can still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's all of those things, and it's extremely alarming, and it should be extremely alarming. And there was essentially, the other thing I'd like to point out is that there's basically no oversight from Congress about this. There really should be. They've been slacking on their oversight of kind of AI and tech in general, and this is another area where they're starting to do that. And we're also, seeing that kind of that the AI space and the Pentagon space are starting to merge. And so, the companies that we think of, the Googles and the Microsofts and the Metas and all of those companies are also starting to get into the game. And so we're kind of seeing the dawn of potentially a whole new arm of the military industrial complex just kind of being born as we're watching.
Yeah, I think sometimes when people are faced with the Pentagon budget, just the numbers for the first time, perhaps, they kind of see it only as something that is happening to someone else, like abroad with whatever the US does with our military elsewhere. So it's important to know about the 1033 program. It's important to know about how ICE and the Pentagon is collaborating, and also the Pentagon and the war economy holds communities, and specifically poor communities, hostage in a number of ways. Lindsay mentioned the poverty draft, which is when poor people feel like they have no other option but to join the military, because then they could go to college. It's a steady source of income for them. So we call that the poverty draft. There's also when either military bases are in town and they make up a huge portion of the job market in any given economy locally. Also, weapons companies who have factories who make up most of the town's jobs. It really forces our hand, kind of, especially if you're living in a small community where there's not a lot of, already the job market's bad no matter where you are at this current moment. But when a whole town is relying on the existence of a weapons manufacturer or a military base, that puts people in a very tough position to resist this expansion of militarism. And also, if you are employed by just the federal, state, local government, whatever it is, generally, a lot of the times we've found through the Divest from the War Machine campaign is that your pensions are it's not just, you're not just getting money taken out of your paycheck to fund the Pentagon. Your pension is invested in the companies taking your money, because these large wealth management groups like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street Corporation, they are the majority owners of the shares of these companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. So they take your money, they take your pensions and invest it into the war economy itself. So not only your job relies on the war economy, it also, your retirement relies on the war economy too. So it just puts workers in a really sticky situation. And I just wanted to acknowledge, because I'm seeing some questions about that we'll get to in the Q&A portion. But yeah, there's just so many ways that it seeps into our daily life. And you mentioned the reconciliation budget, which Trump was calling the big beautiful bill. If some of you are more familiar with it, colloquialism. What do you think, Lindsay, the sort of the psychological toll of living in a war economy is, and like what's the outcome of this austerity that we're seeing?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, so one thing just about what you were just saying, the jobs, this is something that the contractors do completely intentionally. They kind of sprinkle jobs around congressional districts and states so that members of Congress have a stake in their own district to defend the spending. And they do it very consciously. It's very intentional. And, so you'll see things like the F-35 jet fighter parts of it are made in over 300 congressional districts. That's crazy. That's one weapon system. And they've managed to just kind of drop little pieces here and there so that they'll make sure that they get the majority of members of Congress who have people in their district whose jobs depend on this weapons program continuing. So it's completely cynical, and it's completely intentional. The other thing they do that I think is maybe less known is they kind of inflate their job claims. So they'll do this thing called economic impact analysis, where they say how many jobs they're creating, but it doesn't just include the jobs of people they're actually hiring. It includes the jobs of like grocery store workers who serve the communities that are where people have those jobs. So when those people go to the grocery store and spend their paycheck, they're saying that's supporting that grocery store clerk's job. People in all industries do that, but people in all industries don't have the same ability to claim it that the military industrial complex does. So they'll put out these studies saying, we created 1,000 jobs, but actually it's only 500 jobs. And then they're claiming those other jobs as part of their job creation also. So it's completely inflated. And then there's research showing that if you put that same money into healthcare or into education or into clean energy, you can actually create more jobs doing any of those things. So it's completely misleading. But, I mean, I think the psychological toll, people may be familiar with kind of the concept of moral injury, of sort of, this is something that, veterans who participate in wars will come back and have this sense of like moral trauma from participating in it. I think that probably exists for some of the military industrial workers also. Probably depends on the degree to which they're aware. I know that some of them feel a sense of pride in their work, and some of them feel that they're participating in something that's not okay. And so there's obviously a mix there. But I think, yeah, I think there's is there a sort of a war washing, like the greenwashing equivalent for war washing? Um, I think what it does is it creates a lot of denial around kind of what's being done and what what are these weapons factories doing? In my local community, we have an L3 Harris employment facility. It's not a factory, it's like an office facility. But I think it creates an incentive for people who are involved in those industries not to look at what's actually going on. And so I think that's a danger. I think it creates an incentive for a lot of people in those communities not to look at what's going on. Obviously, there are plenty of people who are willing to look at it and people who protest those facilities in every community, including mine, and I think probably a lot of the people here. But I think it definitely sort of creates a culture of death and sort of the idea that this is okay in a way that is really damaging, both in terms of our foreign policy and what people are willing to accept, but then in a way that probably also boomerangs back to us in a way of sort of what people are willing to accept here at home. And that's, I'm sure, connected to the acceptance that we've seen of Trump's immigration policies, although I think that's starting to turn against him. But and I'm sure connected to sort of the acceptance of policing and the acceptance of all of these sort of other violence and control policies that we see from our governments.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more like hard to deal with emotionally when it comes to anti-war organizing in the US specifically. So when you talk to people about the Pentagon budget and the war economy, I think, usually if you're talking about Gaza, you can get people to, have sympathy and care a little bit more now than you used to be able to. And then when you talk about the trade-offs happening at home, like even with I think it really came to light last week with the reconciliation bill, but it's like this like aura of austerity around us our entire lives is really just like people really don't think that they deserve better sometimes. And that's it's just so heartbreaking, just talking to people around the country who are just like worn down by like living in this economy that doesn't work for anyone.
Yeah.
And it's just so sad.
Yeah. And I think there's an acceptance that, of course, the government's going to spend money on war and weapons and the Pentagon and people who have jobs in those industries, but that it's not as legitimate for the government to spend money on things like healthcare or education or clean energy or any of the other things that could create more jobs and could create better jobs that would actually, make our lives better. But those are things where, it's seen as illegitimate for the government to be involved, or there's a myth that there's not enough, that there aren't enough resources for the government to be involved in those things.
Yeah. And I'll transition us to questions for like 10 minutes before we have to wrap up. But we actually got a question that I kind of feeds into that is how can local quote war workers be transitioned into local peace workers? Folks don't want to lose their incomes and benefits.
Yeah. So there's a great book about that. It's not funny like Bill Hartong's book, but there's a great book about that by Miriam Pemberton called 6 Stops on the National Security Tour. And it's actually about 6 communities in the United States that each rely on these contractors and these war economy jobs in a big way, and sort of who the people are in those communities who are interested in transitioning away, what the options for those communities might be to transition away. And it's a great resource for kind of how to start thinking about that. One example, thank you for dropping it in the chat. So one example that I know is that Miriam has been working with folks in upstate New York, where there are a lot of subcontractors for military contracts. So, this is that sprinkling of jobs in kind of all of these different places with like little subcontracts and little bits of money here and there, where there are labor folks who are interested, and some company leaders who are interested in starting to get away from some of that work. So I think some of it comes from sort of working with workers and especially labor leaders who are interested in making that transition for moral reasons, who certainly exist. And so like on the national level, UAW has kind of been embroiled in having this discussion internally where they have made statements against the US involvement in Gaza and come out on other fronts, and are really and they have membership that works at these contractors. So they're kind of struggling with that. So a lot of this is happening in the labor movement. There's a lot going on there. It's very difficult. It's very complicated. I don't want to oversell it as like a magic fix, but that is one of the places where some of this is happening. And then some of it's happening, some of it has been or was happening in kind of the transition to clean energy. So Oshkosh, which is in Wisconsin, a big Pentagon contractor, was at one point going to start building clean mail trucks. And that kind of went off the rails, but it was really interesting. Like that's the kind of thing that we need. And that would have been a federal contract. And so it would have still kind of kept them in business by shifting over to this other lane that would have done something worth doing. And that's sort of another, it could come from on high if those kind of federal contracts were in the works, which clearly they're not under this administration.
Yeah, thank you for that. And highlighting the importance of unions in this fight is so, so critical. And I'll add, like, when we talk about, we call it a just transition, which is, transitioning the war economy to the peace economy in different ways. War economy jobs to green jobs, like Lindsay was saying. And that stuff doesn't happen overnight. It's like it would have to be a long investment process. So right now, if you are in STEM and college going into engineering, you'll probably get recruited by Lockheed Martin. If there's more investment into things like green energy in the future, and more federal grants going out for that kind of thing, there's likely going to be a different brain drain. Instead of going for the Lockheed Martin, you're going to different fields of work that actually help the people and planet. So it's not an overnight thing. It's like a long-term economic adjustment because it really would require flipping the entire economic system in the US upside down in a way to move away from this. But let's see, we have a couple other questions. I think how is Hartung's book humorous? Because the corruption and ripoffs are so blatant. I'll just give a short answer, yes. And he's just kind of a funny guy. Like he has quips.
He's actually a stand-up comedian on the side. So
yeah.
He is a funny guy. It's dark humor, obviously, but yeah, he manages.
Yeah, really good, really good. I also went on an episode of a podcast called The Busted Business Bureau about Lockheed Martin, where we are only referencing Bill's book. So if it's easier to listen than to read a dense book, that's also an option. All right, this is a longer question. I'd be interested to hear more about the interaction between the giant Pentagon budget and the phenomenon we're seeing over and over of troops not having the resources they need on the ground. For example, the lack of body armor and armor for vehicles as early as the second war in Iraq. As a veteran, I remember almost always having to scrimp and not getting the resources I needed to do my job, and yet the Pentagon budget is so huge.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know if I have any great things to offer. I mean, it's really, one thing you're hearing so much now from like the current Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is about doing things for the warfighter and the warriors. But I can't begin to believe that what he actually means is providing protection for troops. And what I would say is that, the biggest mistake in the second Iraq war in terms of protecting troops as bad as it was to not have personal protective equipment and not have the body armor and all of those things, clearly the biggest mistake was having people there in the first place. If we hadn't sent troops there, you wouldn't have needed the body armor. And I think that's I think the deepest and truest thing about it. And I think that as long as we have Pentagon leadership and national leadership that is willing to send American troops into a situation like that, it will not be leadership that is worried about making sure that you stay alive. That's just, those things are mutually exclusive. So I think, clearly what we need is leadership that is far more reluctant to send people into those situations in the first place. Because war is never going to be a good situation. I mean, if you have all the body armor in the world, you're not going to come home in one piece mentally or psychologically or emotionally, or, maybe physically, maybe you get that. But I think what we really need is just leadership that isn't putting troops in those situations in the first place. And I think if we had that, that might also be leadership that was more likely to think about what's actually facing the people that we send when we send them.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone needed more proof about how little the political leadership in this country cares about troops they send abroad or troops when they come back home, is I think in the first, I don't know if it made it into the final version of the reconciliation, but in the first version, it included cuts to the VA, and VA healthcare. Do you know if it made it into the final?
No, there were not cuts to the VA in reconciliation. There have been cuts. Doge has made cuts.
Oh, yes, that's what I'm thinking
Okay.
about. You're right.
Yes, so that's another question.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I promised to Noor and Grace I'd keep us on time. So I want to thank you, Lindsay, so much. This was such a great conversation. I hope people got something out of it. I feel like I could talk about this subject for maybe 5 more hours. So maybe we'll do more. Maybe we'll do a part 2 later on. But if you haven't yet in the chat, if you're here, please sign our petition to cut the Pentagon budget. It includes all of the things we talked about here today. They're working on the Pentagon budget right now. Trump just submitted his request for the Pentagon budget, and it's over $900 billion. It'll probably end up being over $1 trillion after Congress gets its hands on it. So we really, really need to be raising this up as much as possible. So please sign and share the petition with people around you, people that you know, your neighbors, your friends, etc. But Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate all your wisdom.
Yeah, thanks so much, Danica, and thank you everyone for taking your Monday night here.
Yes, thank you both so much again for a great session. Danica and Lindsay, you all did so well, and I was sitting here thinking I knew about what you all were talking about, and I'm just learning so much. So it really just speaks to how much knowledge you all shared. And thank you all for joining our third summer school session. All of the resources that we shared are going to be added to our summer school resource page, so you'll be able to find them there. I saw a lot of folks in the chat talking about how to combat such large systems like the war economy, military, prisons, all these things that seem like they're taking over every aspect of our lives. And I just want to remind everybody that these summer school programs are an important tool to stand against those systems of oppression. You all are in the right place. Equipping yourselves with knowledge, engaging our community and each other, and taking action locally with what you learn is how we stand against militarism in our everyday lives. I saw that in the chat, some people were a little feeling a little it's a heavy topic. I understand, it feels negative at times. It feels a little heavy. But when we hear these things, this is our motivation to move forward. This knowledge is the hope that we need. Seeing everybody on this call is our hope for the future. And it's really up to us to create that hope. And if we want to take action, we have to be informed. So it's really important, and you all are in the right place. And I'm so proud of you all for joining our third session. We can't wait to see you at our next summer school session. It's going to be Monday, July 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So in 2 weeks at the same time that you all joined today. The topic for that session is going to be propaganda and media literacy. And we have 2 special guests, Leanne Fuleihan and Dr. Asal Rod. So it's going to be another great session. You guys don't want to miss it. And one more thing, if you all want to join our virtual cohort for the People's Forum Summer School, which is starting July 15th, if you guys just can't get enough knowledge, can't get enough education, it would be really great to have you all join that as well. But for now, thank you all for joining another summer school session. You all did great. I hope that you've all been enjoying this series and it's been really beneficial. And I can't wait to see you all in 2 weeks. Have a good night.
Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Danica. And put that People's Council in the chat or in the notes when you send. Thank you, darling.
Thank you all so much.